think it's important to remember that while there might be an initial feeling of it went from 47 to 43% of Canadians over 15 volunteering, that Canadians continue to be very generous with their time and very engaged. That's a very high rate, and I think that's something we all have to remember. At the same time, we also have to think about some of the patterns we are seeing so that we can prepare for the future. But to think about the fact that the total the total amount of hours that were contributed by volunteers remains the same is interesting, and there's some reasons for that. So when we think about the decrease, just looking at that in simple terms, a lot of it can be explained by the demographic shift. So if, for example, we understand that as people get older, their volunteering rate decreases, then it stands to reason if the population is aging, then the average rate will decrease, because there are more people over 55 who tend to have a lower volunteering rate, so the average is going to be lower. At the same time, it also makes sense that the total number of hours was the same, because as people get older, they also volunteer more hours. So that's how we're maintaining the number of hours while there is a decrease in the rate. So that's one part of it that on the surface we could say there's a simple explanation simply by the population and the distribution of the ages. The more concerning thing, and there's some strategies that we can look at there, the more concerning thing is what we're seeing in the 35 to 44, the middle age group. And that consistently has been high in terms of the rate and in terms of the number of hours, and we're seeing a decrease in both. And that's something that we have to think about. Why is that happening? What's going on in society, in communities that could explain that? Some of the things that we've heard about recently have been the multiple family responsibilities in terms of caregiving. That many people in that age group, whether you call it the sandwich generation, and there's a number of different metaphors for that, but people who are caring for children perhaps, who may have issues with adult children, spouses, and elderly parents, multiple generations. With the decreasing number of services available in the community for caregiving, the burden on family is even greater. And many people are finding that that has had an impact on the availability to be able to volunteer outside the home. So that's one thing that we should look at, find out more about, and see whether that is in fact an explanation for what we're seeing, and see what we need to know for the future to deal with that. So that's one thing to look at, but I think that all of us, when we look at the contrast over the years in that age group, it does warrant a further explanation. The other thing I would say is that the optimism about having a consistently high rate among youth, 15 to 19-year-olds, 66% are volunteering. Now, many people might say that is because of the mandatory community service, and I want to say that I really find it difficult when people say that. The reason being is, even in this report, only 20% of people aged 15 to 19 said that they had, in fact, volunteered because they were in some kind of mandatory program. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that most of those mandatory programs are, for example, in Ontario, 40 hours over 4 years. So even if you did all 40 hours by coincidence in the 12 months before the survey was taken, that wouldn't account for the fact that that age group has 110 hours on average of volunteering. So I think one of the things that we need to be really careful about is to recognize and acknowledge and break the myth around town where people say youth are only volunteering because they have to. They're only there to get their hours. That's absolutely not what the data is showing, and I think it's something that we need to take seriously. So of course that is a lot of editorializing on my part, but I think it's part of what we need to do to focus on something that is hugely positive, and at the same time, if we're not careful about how we handle that, I think that there are some dangers there.